now.
Hello, everyone. Yet once again, it's another day of fresh grace and mercy. This is the Guilt, Grace, Gratitude podcast, sponsored by Logos Bible Software, where we bridge the gap to Reformed Christian theology for your listening pleasure. And today we're doing a book club episode with a repeat guest. Today we have Dr. Michael Kruger back on our show, and he wrote a book called Bully Pulpit, Confronting the Problem of Spiritual Abuse in the Church, and it's published by Zondervan. And so there's a link to our show notes to Zondervan. So hit that link. You can see what this book looks like and order it for yourself or someone you know. Of course, there's some other reminders like a link to find a close Reformed or confessional church near your area to call home or to refer to somebody else. And then just resources of how to communicate with Peter and myself about the show, ask questions, how to find us, that kind of stuff. And also our bridge builders, Logos Bible Software. So we'll just jump right into this conversation. I'll let Peter further introduce our repeat guest today, Dr. Michael J. Kruger.
Yeah, we have Dr. Kruger. We've had him on a couple months ago, so I won't do a huge introduction. But he's president and Samuel C. Patterson Professor of New Testament Early Christianity at RTS, Reformed Theological Seminary in Charlotte, North Carolina. And he's the author of this book and many other books, but it's a pleasure having you back on the show after not too long after having you on last. So thanks for coming on.
Thanks, guys. It was only 2 months ago. I can't, 3 months ago. Like I can't remember. I'm terrible with dates, but it's good to be back.
Yeah, it's good to have you back too. So yeah, I think Nick's got the first question that we'll kind of jump right into this.
Yeah, and if people listen to the last conversation and just reminding people that you're really known for your work in New Testament canon and apologetics, and then so this book is a little bit different from what people are normally used to reading from you. So where did and how did the idea come up to write this book called Bully Pulpit? There's obviously there's been bullies and toxic leaders throughout the Bible and through Christian history. So is there something unique about the time we're living in right now that makes this book necessary?
Yeah, that's a very common question I get asked when I chat about this book, because people do like, why are you writing this book? And there's so many layers to this. I mean, it's true. I mean, most of my work's in canon and early Christianity and more academic. So I don't really ever write on leadership. I don't know that I've ever written on leadership. And moreover, if you're going to write a book on leadership, I mean, who wants to write a book on bad leaders, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, This is the other thing. I'm like, I didn't want to write this book, but it basically was born out of the last 4 or 5 years, what I've seen in the national scene and in my own circles, to be honest, where as a seminary president, even though I have my own academic interests, I'm still thinking about broader leadership issues. And certainly I want to be very careful about the direction of the church, the kind of leaders we're producing, the kind of leaders we're seeing. And honestly, I was having some real concerns about this even before the Rise and Fall of Mars Hill podcast hit, where now everybody's talking about spiritual abuse. But I was already into my research mode before that, and that just confirmed that I thought a book like this needed to be written.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I was looking through your website too, and you kind of peeked it before we started recording, but you have I think a series on the Bully Pulpit that started sometime early last year. So if you want to talk about how that kind of turned into the book too.
Yeah, so I was invited to speak at the Gospel Coalition National Conference. I think this is 2021. I'm sorry. Remember I said I was bad with dates? Well, here I am again, bad with dates.
So are we. Don't worry.
And so as a lead up to my session at the national conference, I decided to write a blog series on spiritual abuse. I think it started in January 21. And what was crazy about it is I've never had a blog series with more interest and more hits than that one. It went crazy. And I had people writing me from all over the country saying, similar to the stuff we were talking about before we came live on the podcast, which is like, are you talking about my church? Or I went through what you're describing. Yeah. I had an email yesterday. Someone wrote me, having read the book, saying it was like pages and pages saying what you described in the book happened to me. Well, I've gotten, tons and tons of these. And so it really clearly struck a nerve. And then about a year later is when or a little while later is the Mars Hill podcast came out.
Yeah. So that's a good segue into this. And you talk about this in the introduction of your book. You talk about what this book is and kind of what this book is and more specifically what you're writing towards. So amongst all the other books written on abuse, and we've had a couple authors on. Justin Holcomb comes to mind.
Yeah,
a few of the guys who've written on abuse specifically. What do you think you can bring to this conversation as a New Testament professor, New Testament scholar, and seminary president?
Yeah, so there have been other books on spiritual abuse, of course, many, and many of them are good, and
Yeah.
I allude to them in the book.
Mhm.
That made me hesitant. Like, what am I trying to accomplish here? But I really felt like the niche for this book is a Christian leader to other Christian leaders. So I'm not writing to the victims of abuse as much as I care about them. It's not a book
totally.
to heal them. I'm not writing to the perpetrators of abuse directly. I'm writing to the church as a leader that says, look, this is something we need to pay attention to. Yes, even in our circles. And sometimes I think you can dismiss a concern because it's not in your circles. And then you can say, well, that's their problem. And I feel like maybe a voice from within our own circles can get a hearing. And also I bring a perspective as a biblical scholar and seminary president. I don't know that many of the other books have been written by folks that come from that perspective. And so that combined sense of things, thought, okay, maybe I can be a little help here.
Yeah, before next question, I think this is relevant too, kind of as a bridge between mine and Nick's. And you write about this in your book. And I think sometimes like us reform focused, like more reform leading folks, like, no, like our doctrine like doesn't allow bad leaders. It doesn't allow spiritually abusive leaders. And we kind of have this church thing figured out, and all those other kind of big church, mega church evangelicals and the celebrity pastors, like they're the real problem. So maybe you can kind of speak to our own kind of circle too.
Yeah, that I hear that all the time. And this is again part of the reason why I felt like maybe me writing this book would be helpful, because in our circles, we're fairly confident about our polity most of the time.
Yeah.
That, hey, we're not
like
one of those
nothing bad can happen here because we got all the accountability.
If you have a Presbyterian polity, then you're protected. Well, sad to say, it doesn't quite work out like that. I'm happy to have a Presbyterian polity. I believe in it. I think you've got to have good church government.
Yeah,
but the idea that
that's not me like putting bad stuff on the I'm a Presbyterian. Yeah,
but the idea that alone is a solution, some magic bullet here. It isn't true. A lot of the cases I study came in just those circles. People say if you have more hierarchy, more church courts, more verticalism, it improves the problem. Well, some of the worst cases in the UK are in Anglican situations, which are even more hierarchical structured than Presbyterian circles. So part of it is a blind spot problem, which, sometimes when you have a blind spot, of course, the whole point is you don't know it's a blind spot. And here's the other thing. People make celebrity pastors out to be pastors of big churches. I changed that definition in my book. I don't think a celebrity pastor is about the size of the church. It's about the disposition of the church towards the celebrity pastor, and the disposition he has towards himself. So you can be a big fish in your own little pond. There can be celebrity pastors in churches of 50 members.
Yeah, that's right. And that hits home. That's about the size of our church.
And we know that because a lot of the churches in our circles are small.
Yeah,
but you can be the big guy in your small circle, and it doesn't change the dynamic. So you don't have to be on TV for this to be a problem.
Yeah, and part of this awareness that you're talking about is recognizing who these toxic leaders could be. So maybe you could help us understand what are some of the characteristics of a spiritually abusive bully versus what a faithful church leader, as Christ calls them to be, would look like.
Yeah. So one of the things I say in the book is first of all, I say very plainly that the vast majority of pastors are godly, humble people doing a great job. And I feel like I can say that because I'm around pastors every day of my life. I'm a pastor. Right. We train pastors. I'm really thankful and optimistic about the state of pastors. But that doesn't mean there's not some things to address. And so we need to know what to look for. I spent a lot of time in the book on the definition of spiritual abuse, making sure we know what it is and what it isn't. Spiritual abuse is not just telling somebody that the truth of the Bible. That's not abusive. Upholding God's standard is not abusive. Simply being in disagreements with people, saying something you wish you hadn't said, is not abusive. But some of the track record signs of abusive leaders involve many things. But one of the hallmark indicators is what scholars have called a debris field of broken relationships. So if a person has been in ministry, say 20 years, and behind their ministry is just a trail of dead bodies that goes back years and years and years, this debris field of broken relationships. We're not talking about I had a uncomfortable conversation or something. We're talking about destroyed lives, people who are estranged from this person, wrecked churches, wrecked individuals. that is like red flag number one. If you find a church or a pastor that's the situation with, you just need to know more. I mean, maybe there's another explanation, but truth of the matter is that pastor is the centerpiece of every one of those conflicts, and that needs to be looked into.
Yeah, it sounds pretty familiar to me, because it's one of the big sayings that a pastor who people will read about this guy in the book. One of his big sayings, and I remember hearing this during some of our staff conferences or like staff videos, where it's like, if you're not with us, get behind us, we're gonna run over you. And I was like, I remember at that time thinking like, oh, that's like a good strong leader, like he's
let's go, rah, yeah, exactly.
And you talk about this in the book, where it's like, maybe I didn't really think about the people who were getting run over all that often.
Yeah, people are for narcissistic, spiritually abusive leaders, they know they're crushing people, but they write it off as an inevitable collateral damage to the great, amazing work they're doing for the kingdom of God. And so it's correlated with their own self-assessment that what I'm doing is indispensable, which is not true. But it also is this idea that this is just part of ministry. Of course, you're going to destroy people's lives. And I'm like, no, that doesn't mean there's never conflict. Yes, but this idea that you're running people over with your ministry bus is, disheartening to say the least. And that mentality is out there more than we think.
And that leads to this, because again, you talk about this in your book, and I think people know this is relatively the waters that we're swimming in right now. As we live in a quote unquote victim culture, and most churches and their elders tend to turn either kind of a blind eye to those who come to the leadership with stories of abuse, or simply respond, like you said, like, well, everyone's a sinner, so that's like kind of get with the group. But you talk about this unfortunate response in most churches to accusations of pastoral abuse. So based on what you say in the book, how would you come alongside, because you do talk to the victims at points, how would you come alongside the victim of abuse and approach the church leadership too?
Yeah, well, you tapped into sort of the most common thing out there, and I've done a lot of podcasts already on the book. Book's only been out a month. I feel like I've been doing podcasts like crazy on this thing. And one of the big things people say, well, isn't just, if you raise concerns about spiritual abuse, aren't you just feeding the victim culture of our modern progressive world, where everybody's offended by everything? And first of all, I acknowledge that we do live in a victim culture, and people are offended by a lot of things. But what I've noticed is people use that as a shield, that reality, to say nothing to see here. And that's really sad. Is it true that sometimes people exaggerate things and are overly sensitive in churches? Well, yeah, anybody who's been in ministry for 5 minutes knows that's true. But the idea that all of this can be swept under the rug of, they're just a bunch of woke progressives who don't like church authority. I'm like, whoa, slow down. That is just not fair or accurate to what I'm seeing. What people don't realize, a lot of people who are suffering under spiritual abuse are in very conservative churches. And they are there on purpose because they believe in the vision of that church. So the idea that the people who are spiritually abused are these woke progressives. I'm like, if you talk to any of these people, because I have, and they're in very conservative churches, and then after it happens to them, they become disillusioned about what they originally were for. And so the idea that they're showing up at the door already committed to progressive ideas is just simply not the case for most of these situations. So I think we need to be very careful about that. Obviously, people can be oversensitive. And so I talk about how to do, you need a really good third-party investigation to really get to the bottom of it. So you can be accurate and fair to everyone. But dismissing it on the front end under the heading of, well, we live in a therapeutic world, so therefore this is all just nothing, I think could be very unfortunate.
And as we signaled earlier, spiritual abuse and bully pastors are no new thing. There's actually quite a few biblical examples of some of these people. Could you let us know who are some of these examples we find in scripture, and how can we actually learn from these stories?
Yeah, I think one of the questions that was asked a minute ago, I probably never quite got to is, is this thing a new thing? And one of the things that I always knew that this was in the Bible, but, sometimes when you do a fresh study of something, you're sort of amazed what you find. And look, the listener should know that abusive leadership has been there since day one of the fall. I mean, because this is what humans do who are sinful. They lord it over other humans in cruel ways. And that's just part of world history. It's part of church history. And it's part of biblical history. And so I walk through a number of different things. I mean, some of the highlights are going to be obvious. You've got the Ezekiel 34 shepherds of Israel passage where God goes after the shepherds of Israel and says, you have not cared for my sheep. In fact, you've been harsh and cruel to them. You've not fed them, but fed yourselves. You've got the Hophni and Phinehas situation where Eli's sons are off the rails, not just with sexual abuse, but with intimidation and abuse of power. And they are held accountable, as we all know. And so was Eli for that. On the New Testament side, of course, it's everywhere. Jesus talks about not lording it over. This interesting word, katakiriuo, which comes up multiple times. Jesus uses it in Mark 10. Peter uses it in 1 Peter 5 when he says, don't domineer those who are under your care. And so here's the summation of it. The Bible recognizes that there's something called spiritual authority. It's real. We're not saying do away with it. We're not saying that it's a false category. But what the Bible repeatedly does is says, if we're going to give sinful people authority, we need to realize there's real dangers to how that can be wielded. So we've got to really pay attention to that. And the Bible says it time and time again. What I'm stunned by in our circles is that we believe in total depravity, but yet we almost pretend like this isn't really a danger. And I'm like, what? I thought we were reformed last time I checked.
So we're just like a doctrine in our head,
so it's like,
instead of like seeing it play out. Yeah,
it's like it's like total depravity applies to everybody else but ministers. No, you've got to be honest about this. Sometimes we're gonna use our authority in ways that aren't right, and that needs to be handled. So,
those are some good biblical reminders and examples. And now,
you see, the King David. You see all these people who are the king of Israel, who kills another army officer so he can get with his wife. And then
there you've got what would be arguably sexual abuse. You've got abuse of power,
and everything. And
then Saul, of course, was not Saul in particular, although he was the problem, but just you think of the passage where Israel asked for a king like all the other nations. And God basically says, I'm not sure you really want that, because he's going to basically rule you harshly. And the people are like, well, we're good with that. And that is an example of how you want the powerful, dynamic king rather than the humble, gentle shepherd. You're going to get a guy who puts your sons and daughters into slavery, which is what the passage says. And
it's almost like churches have always wanted this.
And if you look at the celebrity pastor culture we're in, I think we are kind of like the nation of Israel. The kind of leader we want is the kind of leader the world tells us we should want. And we've got to really rethink that. And I my book can't solve all that, but hopefully it's a little bitty, tiny step forward.
Yeah, the Saul example I thought was particularly helpful, like you were just explaining. Now, another example wouldn't be related to biblically, but more like practically every day with police officers. How do you describe that? And so can you explain how you connect this police officers, how you connect them to your examples with church leaders, and how particularly?
That's proven to be a really helpful example, because here's another pushback I've gotten, and I understand all these pushbacks, to be fair. I mean, one pushback I've gotten is like, wasn't the bigger problem that churches mistreat their pastors rather than pastors mistreating their churches? And I say in the book, of course that happens. And we don't know how often it happens. We don't have statistics on either of these things, but arguably it happens a lot. I've had it happen to me. We've all been mistreated in the ministry. It's hard being in ministry. But there's a couple pushbacks to that. One is, first of all, the character and actions of the pastor are held to a higher standard than the character and pastor of the average congregant. Okay, so we start with us first. That would be the first thing. Second thing is the idea that, well, the real problem is congregations mistreating pastors is analogous to how it is with police. As soon as you bring up a person in a conversation, say, look, I think the police need some work in terms of abuse of power or overly using force. The most common kickback is, first of all, you hate cops. And then secondly, don't you think that really it's criminals that hurt cops more than cops ever hurt criminals? And I'm like, well, that even may be true. I think it's probably true that criminals probably hurt cops more than cops hurt criminals. But we also can't ignore what looks like a growing number of cases of where cops really do mistreat the people that they're dealing with. And that needs to be called to attention. Doesn't mean you don't love cops. It doesn't mean that you don't acknowledge that sometimes criminals mistreat cops.
They're just held to a higher standard.
They're just held to a higher standard, and you address what's in front of you. When you see it, you have to address it. And that's the way it is with a church. I'm like, look, maybe someone needs to write a book on how churches mistreat their ministers. Write that book. We need someone to tell the churches, love your pastor, care for them. Okay, that's all true and right, needs to be said, but that's just not what I'm trying to say. I'm trying to write about abusive leaders, and I think those other things are important, but hopefully they won't distract from the problem at hand.
One thing we haven't really touched on, and I'll use this as a transition to my question. is, and not to say it's worse or anything, but abuse coming from a spiritual leader versus from a leader outside. So what maybe is unique about something, whether it be physical, sexual, mental, spiritual, coming from a spiritual leader particularly versus somebody else? And I'm not saying it's worse or better than like a family member or whoever it is, but like what is it particularly about a spiritual leader that comes across so heinously?
Yeah. So this is where the term spiritual abuse has its roots. Why do we call it spiritual abuse? Well, because it's perpetrated by someone who is in spiritual authority over you, and in some sense represents God to you in a way, not in a way as if they're like a prophet like Moses, but in a way they represent God.
Yeah.
And are intended to be your shepherd and your caretaker and someone who looks out for you. And when that person mistreats you and is harsh with you and domineers you, then they represent God in that sense wrongly. And they also are harming the very person they're designed to care for. And so there is a deep, deep cut there spiritually into people's hearts that just can't be replicated. I mean, if your boss at work's a jerk, that's irritating and maybe frustrating, but you're not cut to the core by that because he's your boss at work. But when your pastor is demeaning and derogatory and domineering towards you, then you're like, your whole world can start to really fall apart. And so that spiritual dimension of spiritual abuse is so essential to capturing how painful it is. And so I liken it to spiritual child abuse. And here's why. Think about a child who breaks their arm. If they break their arm on the playground, there's a certain level of pain that they feel in their arm, and they're like, oh, no, I can't play with my friends anymore. But if their arm is broken by their mom, it's the same injury. It's a broken arm. But everybody knows that if your mom broke your arm, there is a psychological and emotional damage to you that's totally different than the broken arm, because your mom's supposed to love you. She's supposed to care for you. She's your mom. How could your mom do that to you? And that's why child abuse is so destructive. You get beat up on the playgrounds, one thing, you get beat up by your parents. That's totally different. And so I think we just need to reckon with that. And here's the big takeaway, especially for your listeners. If you're a pastor or you're a minister, your words and your actions have much more power and influence than you think they do.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, much more. You think it's at 10%, it's at try 1,000%.
Oh yeah, I mean it's then you're like whatever I say.
Yes, whatever you say. You don't think people are listening to you, but they are.
Yeah, it's just they just take it hook, line, and sinker, and that's just what they believe.
And you need to reckon with that's exactly why we're going to be judged more strictly as teachers, and that's why our character matters, because we have such a weighty influence in people's lives. So yes, spiritual abuse is painful precisely because we believe, as Reformed folks in particular, that the minister's office really is distinctive.
Yeah. And
so it flows out of our polity, but sadly we don't reckon with what that can do to people.
Yeah. That's why this book, I know Nick read it, and I know he was hit hard by this, but it hit me pretty particularly hard because, I mean, for lack of a better way of saying it, like I'm a pastor of a local small congregation, although I'm still working towards candidacy and ordination, all that stuff. But for all intents and purposes, they call me those who don't know our polity better will call me a pastor. But it does hit me pretty hard to know the stuff that I say.
Yeah, well, that's part of my goal too. I hope pastors read it. And look, I don't think it's like every pastor reads it needs to conclude I'm abusive. No, I mean, like I said, most people probably are not. Now, some will, and I hope they wake up to it. But most of us need to read the book so they can be, wow, I just need to be more careful with what I say. I need to look towards more gentle, humble leadership. If that is the effect of my book, then I will feel really thankful that it's had that effect on people's lives.
Yeah, it was like I didn't tell you before. It was a necessary and it's hard to describe. It's like it's a book that hurts, but I'm glad that it hurts.
Yeah,
because
in a good way. You're like, I needed to hear that, right?
Yeah, exactly. I needed to hear that. Yeah, and so that brings me to one of my last questions. And we talked a little bit about this, but I myself, and you talk about Mark Driscoll, you talk about Mars Hill, so I can name those names because you name the names.
Yeah, and I just draw off the stories that are public.
Totally, yeah. And you talk about a few other pastors, but I won't talk about them necessarily. But so I was at Mars Hill, Huntington Beach, and I'm sure some people listening here have been somewhat affected by that. So I knew this, and so this book hits home in a pretty big way because I was part of those conferences, part of those video calls where I saw this stuff happen. And towards the end of the book, you talk about the damaging effects, spiritual as well as physical and sexual abuse, have on those who then struggle with the faith, their connection to the church, and respect for authority. So can you describe, like, so we've talked about, and there's more that I think neither of us will ever know, because either we've been through it or we haven't been through it. But what kind of effects does spiritual abuse have on those that abuses?
Oh yeah, this was my chapter 6. This was one of the hardest chapters to write. I knew a good bit about this,
and I saw everything you wrote about in your chapter. I saw it in person.
Yeah, I mean, anybody who's been through abuse and reached chapter 6 are going to be like, "Oh my gosh." Yeah, you can see how lives are destroyed. I walk through the documented effects of spiritual abuse in people's lives who either directly experienced it or seen a loved one experience it. And it ranges from, as you might have guessed, real serious emotional impact, everything from fear to anger to shame to those sorts of emotions to even physical effects as it that kind of anxiety and stress starts really working on the body. I mean, a lot of these effects are well established in terms of stress. You're going to have almost PTSD kind of stuff, lack of sleep, insomnia, high blood pressure, even all kinds of other autoimmune issues can come from it. But the biggest damage is spiritual. People start saying, "I'm never going to go to church again.
Mm-hmm.
I'm never going to trust a pastor again." Mm-hmm. And then they start saying, "I don't know if I believe in Christianity anymore. I think this whole thing is messed up and tainted." And so this is actually the intersection, and this is going to be important for you guys too, but also for the listeners. This is the intersection between this issue and apologetics. So people are like, "Why are you writing on this?" Well, I mean, I'm writing on this for lots of reasons, just as a leader, but I'm also writing on because I think this is affecting our witness to the world, and it's part of the way we defend the faith. Don't think it's coincidence that the rise of discussion of abuse and the rise of discussion of deconversions are just accidentally timed with each other. People are leaving the church and deconverting for lots of reasons, but one of the reasons is the stuff they see in the church that's so morally disturbing to them. And so we can't fix that entirely because we're sinners, but we can at least admit it. We can own it, and we can say we're working to change it. And this is part of the apologetic enterprise is saying if we go to the world and say, you guys just making stuff up and
you're just victimizing.
They're like, whatever.
That
gives us no credibility at all. So I think there's a place here for not just compassion for the people who suffered on this, which they need, but also a way to say to the world, we see this, we acknowledge that this is a problem, we're addressing it, and we hope that there's not this sense that this reflects on Christianity, because the Christianity is not the problem here. Jesus is not the problem here. Jesus is the solution here.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
And that's the message we want to get across.
Yeah. And there's a lot that kind of went through my heart, my brain as I was reading this chapter, and I'm sure Nick was thinking, I'm sure you were thinking that the one place that should be your spiritual sanctuary for so many people is the place that they're hurt the most. And it's, it's just, I don't know how to describe how, you want to talk to those who are abused, but at the same time, this is like, how can the church, which is supposed to be dispensing the gospel of Jesus, be the one that most hurts its people?
Yeah, it's really hard, especially when we're defensive about the church.
Yeah.
Like, we want to protect the church. We don't want to attack the church. But let me give a word. But let me give a word to the listeners out there who may be in ministry. You're going to have people who've been abused in other churches come to your church.
Exactly.
And you need to be ready to show them the compassion and care they need. And that doesn't mean that everything that they think happened to them is necessarily accurate. There may be a time to help them understand it better. But I can tell you this, the last thing you want to do is sit down with that person and go, you're probably just progressive, and overly sensitive, and you probably don't like church authority. And that's probably the real problem here. I'm like, no, that's probably not a very good, healthy reaction.
Yeah.
You need to sit down, listen to their story, and find out how you can care for them. And I think that's how people heal, when they have a bad church experience, but they can find another church that listens to them.
Yeah.
And wants to see them recover from it.
Yeah. That was a hard part.
One last question for me, that just kind of came up in my head. It would be that obviously most of our listeners aren't going to be pastors. I mean, most people, the church outnumbers pastors. So just statistics, and most people listening to this are not pastors or in church leadership or authority. They could be listening to this and wonder, oh, I don't want to go to church now. I don't want to join a church. This is scary. I don't want to be
if all
at
this stuff can
risk.
go wrong, like why would I join this
Yeah,
thing?
yeah. That, like, I'll just stay at home. Maybe I am a Christian. I'll just worship at home, or maybe I don't want anything to do with Christianity at all. What would you say to those people that are feeling this right now?
Yeah. Well, first I'd say I understand. I understand that sentiment. I understand the fear and the concern, especially if you've been in an abusive situation. But I also want to say, biblically speaking, you need the church. The church is part of the way that God ministers his kingdom to the world. It's the bride of Christ. And the issue isn't giving up on church, but finding a healthy one. So put your effort towards looking for the signs of a healthy church that you can plug into, serve, and grow. And you know, the isolated Christian mentality, the Bible warns against that. And so I know it feels like that person's protecting themselves, but they're actually making it worse by staying away from the people of God. It's the people of God in a healthy way that can actually help you heal, not cause more trouble. So hopefully my book can be a guide to how to spot a healthy church, right? And you can go in there and find a good one, but you still need one. And so I hope they'll reconsider that path, because I don't think it's going to help them in the long run.
It's a lot like that police analogy. The solution wouldn't be defund the police.
No, that's a great takeaway, right? That defund the police came after I wrote the book.
Yeah,
but
it's just train better
that's
police.
Yeah, people say the real problem here is you shouldn't have cops. I'm like, no one. What?
Yeah, right.
You can't have, you know, no. And so if someone says, well, you shouldn't have the church. No, you need a healthy church.
Exactly.
We need a healthy police force. So we need to work to make that happen. So yeah, I think, you know, you don't throw the baby out with the bathwater on this one.
Yeah, totally. So last question, and this is, and I hope people for the last 10 minutes haven't just been thinking I've been trying to poo-poo on the church. We're trying to be real with the church. Like, it's got warts. It's full of sinners. There's a quote: if you're looking for a perfect church, the second you join it, it's going to be imperfect, because it's full of sinners. So it's, as much as we don't want this stuff to happen, as much as we pray against it, and as much as we want the gospel to go out with purity, we have a sinful church, but its shepherd and head is the perfect redeemer who is redeeming the church. And this goes to your last chapter, because you talk about a way forward to spot abuse and care for those who are abused. So what counsel do you have for churches to spot abusers before more havoc is unleashed? Because you talk about some candidacy stuff with some pastors, what church members can think about too. And those, I think this is also helpful as well. So those who've experienced it, for like, hey, like what do I do now?
Yeah, so the last chapter is designed to give some practical things that churches can do, some structural things mainly, to help address the abuse problem. It's such a tiny step. It's like one of those things where I wrote the chapter, I'm like, man, even if someone does everything I say in here, there's so much more that needs to be addressed. But you got to start somewhere, right? And I didn't want the book just to point out the problem. Those books are depressing. Hopefully to push people towards some good solutions. And there's a lot of things that I cover in there. Obviously, I won't say here, but one of the things I think that really needs attention is the way we vet candidates.
Yep.
You know, it's one thing to stop an abusive pastor after he's already done it. But wouldn't it be great if we could keep people who have abusive tendencies from being in the pastorate? And so I think there needs to be some more front end thinking about the role of character over competency. That it's not just about your abilities and your gifts, although those have their place and they matter. But biblically speaking, ministers are God's concerned much more with our character than our giftedness. And I don't know that we've got that straight. I think we've reversed it. And part of the reason we reversed it is our celebrity culture around pastors. You got to be dynamic and great and amazing and all this. And so character takes a back seat. We need to make sure character's at the front end of our vetting process. And I point out how most times we hire a pastor, I mean, the depth of character analysis we do is we get those two references from their best friends that think they're the greatest guy on the planet. I'm like, look, can we not all be honest for a moment and know that that's just not really that adequate? We all know that we get references by the guys who love us the most, and they're going to write glowing references. And I'm not saying those are irrelevant, but the idea that that's the full vetting of someone's character is really, I think, a problem. And so I think churches, denominations, presbyteries, and arguably here for me, seminaries need to think about how to flip that back to what I think is the biblical framework.
Yeah, and this hits home for me because I went through the candidacy process. Going through the candidacy process, so I see what I'm asked and what's desired of me. So I see a lot of this stuff And hopefully I don't have, I don't think I have abusive tendencies. I'm trying to read this and see, like, is there something in me that I have to work on?
No, but what you're discovering, I bet, in the candidating process is that, I don't know what percentage I'd give, but 80 to 90% of conversations in candidating are about doctrine.
Oh yeah. I was about to say, I think
that's, by the way, I of course we all love
about doctrine
and think that really matters, but the idea that it's 90 to 10, come on, that can't be right, and it can't be sustained. We can't give 10% attention to someone's character and 90 to doctrine and think that's a recipe for success.
Yeah, I love doctrine. This show is all about doctrine. I want to be as doctrinally pure as possible. But I think there is something to be said, and this may not be just a Reformed problem, but I do think there is something. You talk about this in the Reformed Church, where he's got such good doctrine, we can kind of overlook like the other stuff that he can't do as well.
I think that happens.
But yeah, so this and this is a hard book to read, and you do talk about some of the way forward and some of the and not just some of the good, but the God ordained presence of the church and what the church is supposed to do. It's supposed to dispense the gospel, dispense the sacraments, exercise pure church discipline. So this is not a book to like say the church is bad, it's horrible, but it's let's be a little bit more self-introspective. Let's see what the church is doing poorly so that we can get better, so that we can continue the mission. It's not just like, hey, let's leave the church away and do something else. But I like how you end this book. So maybe just kind of an end for those who are thinking about reading this or thinking about the church, because it's like you said, there's a lot of deconversion stories. So maybe just to conclude as a word of encouragement for those who are listening, who might pick up this book and who are either fearful or part of a good church or whatever it is. So any kind of a word of encouragement that you have for those who are listening?
Well, as you said, we want to be very clear. We love the church. We love pastors. The vast majority are great. Mm-hmm. And I think the listener can say, hey, be encouraged. There's a lot of good things going on in the church too. But this may be a very good book to pick up, not only to analyze yourself as someone's in Christian leadership at some capacity, but to be aware of how to care for others who've gone through this, and also so you can find a good, healthy church. As I said at the beginning of this, a number of emails I received from people are like, after reading your book, I realize I might be in a really toxic church. This church maybe really got some issues. Yeah. And I think, people need to be eyes wide open about some of those things before they get caught up in the gears and crushed. And so there's something to be said for using the book also to do some good, introspective about what am I in a healthy church? And if I'm not in a healthy church, how do I find a healthy church? So there's so many ways to apply it, but I hope even though it's a hard topic, I hope the end product here is very positive, which is a healthier church with more humble, gentle shepherds that look more like Jesus. And that's really what we're going for here. We want our ministers to look like Christ, because that's the goal.
Awesome. Well, Dr. Kruger, thanks for writing this book and coming on our show again. It's been a pleasure having you on now for the third time and talking about a hard issue, but I think an issue that has to be talked about more and more often in a gospel-centric, gospel-saturated way. So thank you for writing this, and thank you for coming on our show again.
Yeah, great to be with you guys. Thanks for having the conversation.